reactionism to the surface. For years, I heard about the devilishly clever manipulations of communist propaganda. Later on, I was surprised to discover that news media in communist countries were usually lackluster and plodding. Western capitalist nations are immersed in an advertising culture, with billions spent on marketing and manipulating images. The communist countries had nothing comparable. Their media coverage generally consisted of dull protocol visits and official pronouncements, along with glowing reports about the economy and society, so glowing that people complained about not knowing what was going on in their own country. They could read about abuses of power, industrial accidents, local protests, and earthquakes occurring in every country but their own. And even when the press exposed domestic abuses, they usually went and corrected. Media reports sometimes so conflicted with daily experience that the official press was not believed when it did tell the truth, as when it reported on poverty and repression in the capitalist world. If anything, many intellectuals in communist nations were utterly starry-eyed about the capitalist world and unwilling to look at its seamier side. Ferociously opposed to the social system, they were anti-communists to the point of being full-fledged adulators of Western reactionism. The more rapidly reactionary chic a position was, the more appeal it had for the intelligentsia. Royalist religious fervor. Intellectuals maintained that the capitalist West, especially the United States, was a free market paradise of superabundance and almost limitless opportunity. Nor would they believe anything to the contrary. With complete certitude, well-fed, university-educated Moscow intellectuals sitting on their modest but comfortable apartments would tell U.S. visitors, the poorest among you live better than we. A conservative deputy editor of the Wall Street Journal, David Brooks, offers this profile of the Moscow intellectual. He is a master of contempt, and feeling he is living in a world run by imbeciles. He is not unsure, casting about for the correct answers. The answers are obvious: democracy and capitalism. His self-imposed task is to smash the idiots who stand in the way. He has none of the rococo mannerisms of our intellectuals, but values of bluntness, rudeness, arrogance. These democratic intellectuals love Ronald Reagan, Marlboro, and the South in the American Civil... Oh, no. Consider Andrei Sakharov, a darling of the United States press, who regularly praised corporate capitalism while belittling the advances made by the Soviet people. He lambasted the U.S. peace movement for its opposition to the Vietnam War and accused the Soviets of being military expansionists and the sole culprits behind the arms race. Sakharov supported every U.S. armed intervention abroad as a defense of democracy and characterized new U.S. weapon systems like the neutron bomb as primarily defensive. Anointed by U.S. leaders and media as a human rights advocate, he never had an unkind word for human rights violations perpetrated by the fascist regimes of faithful U.S. client states, including Pinochet's Chile and Suharto's Indonesia, and he directed snide remarks towards those who did. He regularly attacked those in the West who dissented from anti-communist orthodoxy and who opposed U.S. interventionism abroad. As with many other Eastern European intellectuals, Sakharov's advocacy of dissent did not extend to the opinions that deviated to the left of his own. The tolerance for Western imperialism extended into the upper reaches of the Soviet government itself, as reflected in a remark made in 1989 by a high-ranking official in the Soviet Foreign Ministry, Andrei Kozyrev, who stated that third world countries suffer not so much from capitalism as from a lack of it. Either by design or stupidity, he confused capital, which those nations lacked, with capitalism, of which they have more than enough to victimize them. He also claimed that none of the main bourgeois groups are connected with militarism. To think of them as imperialists who plunder third world countries is a stereotyped idea that should be discarded. As a system of analysis mainly concerned with existing capitalism, Marxism has relatively little to say about the development of socialist societies. In the communist countries, Marxism was doled out like a catechism. Its critique of capitalism had no vibrancy or meaning for those who lived in a non-capitalist society. Instead, most intellectuals found excitement in the forbidden fruit of Western bourgeois ideology. In looking to the West, they were not interested in broadening the ideological spectrum, a desirable goal, but in replacing the dominant view of a rightist, anti-communist orthodoxy. They were not for an anti-ideology, but for replacing one ideology with another. Without hesitation, they added their voices to the chorus, singing the glories of the free market paradise. Heavily subsidized by Western countries, the right-wing intelligentsia produced publications like Moscow News and Argumentia and Fakti, which put out a virulently pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist message. One such publication, Vitovtumnaya Gazeta, March 1990, hailed Reagan and Bush as statesmen and the architects of peace. It questioned the need for a Ministry of Culture in the USSR, even one that was now headed by an anti-communist. There is no such ministry in the United States, and yet it seems there's nothing wrong with American culture. Who said Russians don't have a sense of humor? With the decline of communist power in Eastern Europe, the worst political scum began to float to the surface, Nazi sympathizers and hate groups of all sorts. Though they were not the only purveyors of bigotry. In 1990, none other than the Polish Solidarity leader, Lech Walesa, declared that a gang of Jews had gotten hold of the troll and is bent on destroying us. Later on, he maintained that comment did not apply to all Jews, but only those who are looking out for themselves while not giving a damn about anyone else. Yeah, right. Following year, in Poland's post-communist presidential election, various candidates, including Walesa, outdid each other in their anti-Semitic allusions. In 1996, at a national ceremony, Solidarity chief Zygmunt Frozen resorts to anti-Semitic vituperation, and he makes him more railing against the previous communist regime. Romanticizing capitalism. Oh no, let's see what. Oh yes, here's the tip for my American announcement. Yes, thank you very much, son. It's great. In 1990, in Washington, D.C., the Hungarian ambassador held a press conference to announce that his country was discarding its socialist system because it did not work. When I asked why it did not work, he said, I don't know. Here was someone who confessed that he had no understanding of the deficiencies of his country's socio-economic process, even though he was one of those in charge of that process. Leaders who talk only to each other are soon out of touch with reality. The policymakers of these communist states showed a surprisingly un-Marxist understanding of the problems they faced. There were denunciations and admonitions aplenty, but little systematic analysis of why and how things had come to such an impasse. Instead, there was much admiration for what was taken to be Western capitalist know-how and remarkably little understanding of the uglier side of capitalism and how it impacted upon the world. In the USSR, glasnost, the use of critical debate to invite innovation and reform, opened Soviet media to Western penetration and accelerated the very disaffection it was intended to rectify. Leaders in Poland and Hungary, and eventually the Soviet Union and other European communist nations, decided to open their economies to Western investment during the late 1980s. It was anticipated that state ownership would exist on equal terms with cooperatives, foreign investors, and domestic private entrepreneurs. Yeah, so that's ever gonna happen. That's ever gonna happen. Washington Post. 4/17. so April 17th, 1989. In fact, the whole state economy was put at risk and eventually undermined. Communist leaders had even less understanding of the capitalist system than of their own. Most people living under socialism had little understanding of capitalism in practice. Workers interviewed in Poland believed that if their factory were to be closed down in the transition to the free market, the state will find us some other work. New Yorker, November 13th, 1989. They thought that they would have it both ways. In the USSR, Soviet Union, many who argued for privatization also expected the government to continue providing them with collective benefits and subsidies. One skeptical farmer got it right. Some people want to be capitalists for themselves but expect socialism to keep serving them. Guardian. The Guardian. October 23rd, 1991. Reality sometimes hit home. In 1990, during the Glasnost period, when the Soviet government announced that the price of newsprint would be raised 300% to make it commensurate with its actual cost, the new pro-capitalist publications complained bitterly. They were angry that state socialism would no longer subsidize their denunciations of state socialism. They were being subjected to the same free market realities they so enthusiastically advocated for everyone else, and they did not like it. Now that everyone romanticized capitalism, many of the Soviet and Eastern European emigres who had migrated to the United States during the 70s and 80s complained about this country's poor social services, crime, harsh work conditions, the lack of communitarian spirit, vulgar electoral campaigns, inferior educational standards, and the astonishing ignorance that Americans had about history. They discovered they could no longer leave their jobs during the day to go shopping, that their employers provided no company doctor when they fell ill on the job, that they were subject to severe reprimands when tardy, that they could not walk the streets and parks late at night without fear that they might not be able to afford medical services for their family or college tuition for their children, and that they had no guarantee of a job and might experience unemployment at any time. Among those who never emigrated were some who did not harbor illusions about capitalism. In fact, numerous workers, peasants, and elderly were fearful of the changes ahead and not entirely sold on the free market mythology. A 1989 survey in Czechoslovakia found that 47% wanted their economy to remain state-controlled, while 43% wanted a mixed economy, and only 3% said they favored capitalism. New York Times, December 1st, 1989. In May 1991, a survey of Russians by a U.S. polling organization found that 54% chose some form of socialism and only 20% wanted a free market economy such as in the United States or Germany. Another 27% elected for a modified form of capitalism as found in Sweden. Monthly Review, December 1994. Still, substantial numbers, especially among intellectuals and youths, the two groups who know everything, opted for the free market paradise without the faintest notion of its social costs. Against the inflated imagination, reality is a poor thing. Against the glittering image of the West's cornucopia, the routinized, scarcity-ridden, and often exasperating experiences of communist society did not have a chance. It seems communism created a dialectical dynamic that undermined itself. It took semi-feudal, devastated, and underdeveloped countries and successfully industrialized them, bringing a better life for most, but this very process of modernization and uplift also created expectations that could not be fulfilled. Many expected to keep all the securities of socialism overlaid with capitalist consumerism. We shall see. As we shall see in the subsequent chapters, they were in for some painful surprises. One reason siege socialism could not make the transition to consumer socialism was that the state of siege was never lifted. As noted in the previous chapter, the very real internal deficiencies within communist systems were exacerbated by unrelenting external attacks and threats from the Western powers. Born into a powerfully hostile capitalist world, communist nations suffered through wars, invasions, and an arms race that exhausted their productive capacities and retarded their development. The decision by the Soviet leaders to achieve military parity with the United States while working from a much smaller industrial base placed serious strain on the entire Soviet Union, upon the entire Soviet economy. The very siege socialism that had allowed the USSR to survive made it difficult for it to thrive. Perestroika, the restructuring of socio-economic practices in order to improve performance, was intended to open and revitalize production. Instead, it led to the unraveling of the entire state socialist fabric. Though the pluralistic media that were to replace the state socialist fabric. Thus the pluralistic media that were to replace the communist monopoly media eventually devolved into a pro-capitalist ideological monopoly. The same thing happened to other socialist institutions. The intent was to use a shot of capitalism to bolster socialism. The reality was that socialism was used to subsidize and build an unforgiving capitalism. Pressed hard throughout its history by global capitalism's power, full of financial, economic, and military forces, state socialism endured a perpetually tenuous existence, only to be swept away when the floodgates were opened to the